Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give everybody a couple more minutes just as people are trickling in, so stay tuned and we'll be back in a couple of minutes here. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kyle Stupai. I am a physical therapist and the clinical director of the Westchester office of Spear Physical Therapy, located in Pleasantville. I'd like to welcome back those of you who have attended one of our previous webinars, as well as welcome those of you joining us for the first time. We appreciate everybody taking the time out of their busy days and afternoons to be here live with us. For those of you who do not know, Spear is a private outpatient practice for physical therapy. It's been around for over 20 years with 21 locations located throughout the New York City and expanded area. We've successfully continued to offer in-person care through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've also launched Spear Live for those looking to stay in touch and receive care from the comfort of their own homes. In our clinics, we're strategically going above and beyond CDC guidelines to ensure the safety and well-being of everybody in our clinics. You can find out more detailed information on our website at spearcenter.com. We're here for you whichever way makes you feel most comfortable. If you're looking to get individualized care, either in the clinic or through our telehealth platforms, please reach out to us at your earliest convenience and we'll get you set up for an appointment right away. We're excited to share today with you guys the female athlete and strength training hosted by two of our colleagues here at Spear and Athletes Warehouse. As a part of our session today, we'll be walking you through some exercises. You're welcome to follow along at home and practice as you feel comfortable. Please note if you're experiencing any pain while performing any of these, or if you feel unsteady or unsafe to perform them on your own, please stop and reach out to us directly so that we can support you. As you can see, some of us are coming to you live from our own homes, and although we don't anticipate any technical issues today, please be patient with us should they arise. All right, throughout the webinar today, we want to hear from all of you. For anybody who has any questions, please feel free to let us know your thoughts in the Q&A feature below. Please use the Q&A feature, not the chat feature. To find out where that is, take a moment now to hover at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A option pop up. That's where you'll put the questions, and we'll do our best to address as many of them as we can throughout the webinar in our Q&A section at the end. All right. For those of you who are viewing us on YouTube Live, we'll be monitoring the comment section on there as well. So if you're on YouTube Live, please use the comment section. Lastly, there will be times when we'll have multiple panelists on the screen. For the best viewing experience, please select Gallery View in the top right corner of your Zoom screen, so you'll be able to see multiple panelists at one time. All right, so let's go over our goals for the day and what we'll be covering. So we're going to discuss the importance of strength training as it relates to rehab and performance. We're going to go over baseline principles for rehabbing the female athlete. We'll discuss power development and its importance for the female athlete, and discuss the continuum of sports rehab and performance. So before we get started here, I'd like to introduce our team of panelists that we're going to welcome here on the screen and show everybody here. All right, so we have Sarah Lloyd, one of our physical therapists at our Spear Pleasantville office up in Westchester. And next to her, we have Cassie Reilly-Boccia. She's one of the strength training specialists, coaches, and co-founders of Athletes Warehouse, who we share a facility with in Pleasantville. And we also have Alyssa Reyes. She is from our Upper West Side location on 75th Street. Alyssa's going to be handling a lot of the Q&A in the background here with me. So Cassie and Sarah, I'll let you guys take it from here, and we'll be back in a little bit.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyle. So Cassie and I just also wanted to introduce ourselves a little bit more and kind of like go over why this is so important to us and why we're giving this webinar. We're both collegiate athletes. I played lacrosse at Princeton. I graduated in 2014. And I also played in the Women's Professional Lacrosse League until 2020. So obviously I love sports, played a bunch of different sports growing up. And I feel like athletics has totally shaped me to be like the person I am today. And my goal is to just really get like any female, I think, should at least try to get this experience of team sports. I think it really shapes you to be who you are. And I don't want injury to be the reason that people stop playing. So that's kind of why I became a PT and why I like to do what I do. I'll let Cassie introduce herself a little bit too.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Kyle. So my background is not in lacrosse, it's in softball. I played softball for the University of Alabama, where we won 3 SEC championships and the first SEC national championship in 2012. That was also the year I graduated. Although I didn't continue my playing career any further, I started coaching immediately once I got done playing. And it's very cool because I feel I'm very indebted to the sport of softball and just athletics in general. It has certainly provided me with a platform to be able to grow as a professional, to have experienced the moments I did as an athlete, and then to be introduced to people like Spear Physical Therapy, like the athletes that I got to play with. So really what I'm trying to do is create this platform that empowers female athletes, whether that's through the lens of strength training, whether that's through the lens of softball performance, or whether that's through the lens of what we are able to provide with our connection with Spear and injury prevention and recovery. So now we're going to turn this over to Sarah. She's going to go over a little bit of injury statistics moving forward as far as it goes for the female athlete.
Yeah, so you guys know this webinar is more focused on the female athlete in general. So I'm just going to go over a couple of kind of key points in regards to just injuries. So like youth female athletes in particular are more likely to sustain certain injuries than others, like compared to male athletes. They're more likely to sustain overuse injuries. So that could be bony stress fractures or stress reactions, or even just like tendinopathies. And they're also more likely to sustain injuries that require surgery. So especially knees being the most common. Obviously, we all know probably someone who's torn their ACL. We know that's definitely like 2 to 8 times more likely to happen in a female athlete, especially an adolescent female athlete, than a male athlete. And then lastly, the incidence of concussion is actually higher in the female athlete population as well. So the key here being, there's a lot of injuries out there. There's definitely some more that tend to happen to adolescent female athletes in general. And so some of the exercises and the strength stuff that we're going to go through is really catered towards that population. Now I'm going to let Cassie talk a little bit about the more performance side in terms of female athlete.
Thank you, Sarah. So I think it's important to note too that although we are separating injury and performance here, they really are very much so intertwined. So going along with performance, certain things that I think people don't necessarily realize is that we have pockets of opportunity to train athletes, in particular, especially at the youth age when they are growing. So we all associate puberty with this huge growth spurt, and we call that peak height velocity. So that's the moment that their velocity and height is growing at its fastest rate. And we are able to then look at this athlete and say, okay, this is our window of opportunity to focus on speed and power. And that's really crucial because focusing on those aspects as they're growing is going to help with that injury prevention and then thus their potential for overall performance in the future. One of the best quotes I've heard from a professional is that women are not small men. We can't just say, hey, this is what we do for guys. We're going to scale it down for girls. They are completely different. In particular, one of the main structures or main emphasis that we will identify those differences with are the hormonal cycle that they are going through. So the recovery and their performance patterns of the female athlete, even their potential for injury, may be tied to what's going on with their hormones. Lastly, moving through that is as you increase the level of play, we're going to have this increased demand on your strength and power and speed. So we know that the strongest athletes are typically going to be the ones that are most prepared for those next level of play. And we want to make sure that they are also enjoying that. So Sarah and I are both going to touch on the mental side of being a female athlete, because that is truly probably, if not more important, one of the most important aspects to how you work with someone who's a female progressing through sport.
Cool. Awesome. So before we get into some exercise stuff, I just wanted to kind of touch on like why we're talking about strength in regards to like recovery, injury prevention, and then even as Cassie said, it kind of correlates right into performance. So essentially when an injury happens, whether it's an acute injury, whether it's an overuse injury, it's really almost always comes down to the fact that the force that was placed on the tissue was too strong for the tissue to be able to handle. So what do we need to do? We need to increase the like amount of force and strain that tissue can handle. We can pretty much do that with almost any tissue in the body with strength training, right? So even bones get stronger as you load them. Muscles get stronger, obviously, tendons get stronger as you load them. So that's like such a huge component in our, like, you know, anyone who's been to PT, right? You do strength exercise because that's what helps get you better. You can also use it as obviously a performance tool, right? As Cassie said, like the stronger you are, the more likely you end up succeeding in the sport. So it's, I think especially for female athletes, you know, they tend to want to focus on conditioning or just like the sports skills themselves, but emphasizing like the strength development is incredibly important, both for injury prevention and for performance. So we will go through these exercises together with Cassie. They're just some of my favorites that I use for a lot of my athletes. We'll start them pretty basic. There's a ton of progressions. So if you guys ever have questions, you know, we can go over that at the end, but I'll go through some of like the main talking points when it comes to cueing these exercises and why they're so important. But first I'll let Cassie touch briefly on what she's going to go over.
Awesome. So once we go over a lot of these movements that are talking about really recovery for strength, we're going to go into how do we take those same movements, but then I'll apply a little bit of a different stimulus to now make them a little bit more performance-based. So everyone likes to talk about power, and sure enough, you search on Google, that's what parents are looking for. They want their kids to be more powerful. But what people don't realize is you can't have power if you don't have strength first. So really power is this ability to say, the body has to say, okay, I'm comfortable enough absorbing force before I reproduce force. So if they're not, one of two things are going to happen. We're either going to hit a ceiling of our power potential, or like Sarah talked about, injury is going to happen. Everything in sport, for especially, you know, it's very few times that we say that we're not reacting to something in our environment, whether that is running down the lacrosse field, having to react to another individual on the field, or whether or not that is a softball player trying to hit an incoming pitch. Timing and feedback is a huge component to adding into the training environment so that it can then translate into the sport. And then lastly, anytime we can add a competitive edge to our movements, what we're doing is not just tapping in a little bit to the athlete's mental side, but certain hormones start to get released. Adrenaline starts to kick in a little bit more, and we're starting to be able to see, okay, how does this athlete actually perform in training on a field, or excuse me, on a field opposed to just training, which is going to give us a little bit more insight into how potentially an injury might happen or how an injury happened in the past, so we can rectify it before it gets to anything deeper.
Cool. All right. So now we're actually going to take you guys through that list of exercises that we had up. So it's this way you guys can kind of see what we do and why we do it. So for the first part of it, Cassie's going to be the athlete, and I'm going to take her through a couple exercises and just show you guys how we cue them and why it's important. So the first one we had up there is a lateral step down. So typically when we have athletes perform this step down, I don't tend to cue them the first time, and a lot of times they'll just step straight down with that knee going forward, and they'll use a lot of quads. Fine, but not ideal for movement, right? Like when we move on the field, we've got a little bit of a trunk lean, and we've got quads firing, we've got glutes firing, we've got hamstrings firing, we've got a lot going. So if we're using this movement to prepare an athlete for sport, we want them to hit that same athletic stance that they're going to use for everything else. So I'm going to cue Cassie to sit back a little bit. Yep, get her glutes going, keeping her knee pretty in line with her toe as she squats down and then comes back up, right? Mm-hmm. What we don't want to see is sometimes if you tell people to sit back, they'll sit way back, they won't put their knee forward, and that chest comes down super far. So that's when you kind of have to play with the range a little bit, work on core strength. That's a huge component to this exercise too. If they can't quite gather sitting back and you see their trunk coming forward, a lot of times that's due to a lack of kind of overall core stability. Yep, so this exercise becomes really important when Cassie's going to take us to the performance side of things also. Nice.
What's the next one?
Let's do lunges. So The next one we call it a 3D lunge. So there's, for those of you who don't know, there's 3 planes of movement, right? We have like forward and backward is basically a sagittal plane. We have side to side, which we call the frontal plane. And then we have rotation, right? All super important when it comes to sport. We don't just move in one plane, obviously, for any sport. It's all 3. So the first is just a basic forward lunge. Cassie's going to step forward. She's going to lean down. You see how I'm actually letting her knee go over her toe a bit. That's important. When an athlete changes direction, and especially when they decelerate, right, when they're stopping, if they can't get this knee over toe because of pain, because of movement dysfunction, because of weakness, they're at a disadvantage. They can't reach their end range of motion, which is going to happen in a game. And that's when you're going to have some sort of injury, whether it's their knee collapses in at that point, and then, you get an MCL, ACL. So that's really important when it comes to lunging. I let that knee go over toe, depending on, at least in this forward lunge for now, that's totally fine. Next one's going to be a lateral lunge. So Cassie's going to lunge to the right. She's going to sit back and down into her right hip. Yep. So now we're getting a little bit more of that glute firing, because when we change direction, right, you need to get that glute on stretch, because in order for the muscle to fire better, it's got to be stretched a bit. So now if she's in this position, she can better explode out of that to change direction quickly. So that's what the lateral lunge is about. We've got to prepare the body for the movement that they're going to see on the field. I think one of the biggest problems that female athletes have, and why these injuries risks tend to be higher, is that we tend to have more motion, right? Like a lot of people are super flexible or double jointed. And if you don't have control through your full range of motion, you're going to develop some sort of injury or discomfort at that end range of motion when you hit it once you're in a competitive state. Next, we're going to go into an RDL.
Do you want the moving backwards one? This one?
Oh, yeah. Last one. Okay, transverse plane. We forgot rotational. Yep, so Cassie's going to start exactly. This front toe is pointed forward. She's going to rotate out into that basically rotational position. Yep, so her hips go with her and she's nice and stable in that. A lot of athletes just really aren't used to controlling their hips going through that motion. So you're just getting them used to all 3 planes of motion, essentially. A lot of people don't train enough into rotation. All right, now we'll go through the RDL. So Cassie's going to stand on one leg. We call this, it's a single leg Romanian deadlift. And essentially what we're doing is working on control through that full range of motion. She's keeping her hips level, right? So a lot of athletes, when they do this on the field, some people do it as a warm up, right? Like in every sport. And what you see is this hip comes up, right? Because they're trying to balance, they're trying to make it easy on themselves, and they go down really quickly and they're not controlled. And that's what you see. They're using the whole lateral aspect of their leg instead of really like their inner hamstrings and their glutes. And we're really working on stability here, because if you don't have that stability at the hip and the core and the foot, that knee is going to wobble and you're going to end up with some sort of injury. So a single leg RDL is an awesome sort of stability exercise for most athletes. We can go into a Payload Press. So with this one, I'm going to have Cassie hold one end of the band. I can lock it down in a door, or I can hold the other end. And what I like to focus on with this exercise in particular, the first part is what we call anti-rotation. So Cassie's just going to keep everything nice and locked, course engaged, neutral pelvis. She's going to press straight out and back. So just getting her to be able to stabilize is kind of priority number 1. Once she can keep everything nice and still and locked and loaded, we're going to add a rotation piece. So the key with this, I like to cue it, it comes from the hips, right? Any sort of athletic movement, whether it's lacrosse and you're shooting or softball and you're hitting, the first piece to move on your body is your hip or your toe. Force translates through your whole body. Even if you're shooting in lacrosse, right? Your hips are what drives the motion. So that's exactly how she's doing it. She's keeping everything nice and stable, and letting those hips drive the movement. Nice. Nordics. Fun. Okay, this is everyone's favorite exercise. They really work your hamstrings, so which is huge. So they've done so many studies on basically ACL prevention. Hamstrings are your what we call dynamic restraint to the ACL. So they do the same thing as the ACL. They prevent your shin bone from sliding forward on your knee. So the stronger your hamstrings are and the better you move, the less likely you are to injure your knees. This is a really great hamstring exercise that pretty much every athlete should be doing as part of their warm-up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold Cassie's ankles. She's going to lean forward nice and slow and controlled as far as she can.
Oh, am I going down?
Yeah, and then she's going to control with her hands the rest of the movement, and then she comes back up. So she's going to control as far as she can, let herself fall the rest of the way, push herself back up. Great. So you can tell that that really focuses on that eccentric control. And for those of you who haven't been to a webinar before, eccentric control is like the key to decelerating, and that's when injuries happen basically, is during deceleration.
Your last piece, yeah.
All right. So last but not least, we have single leg hopping and bounding. So before we even start running, jogging, jumping, doing any sport specific movement, even running is a lot of time on one leg. It's essentially a bunch of single leg hops. So athletes need to be able to really control what they're doing on one leg and be able to control that plyometric movement on one leg. So I'm gonna have Cassie start on one leg. She's gonna start in like a more athletic stance. She's gonna pop up and land. Perfect. And we're watching a couple of things. Everything we talked about earlier. So this awesome athletic stance with her knee directly over her toe. If you turn to the side, you can see how her trunk is a little bit leaned forward, so she's getting some glute activation, but she's not stiff in the knee, right? We want knee flexion. We want a little bit of trunk flexion. It's a really, that feels awful.
It's terrible.
So this is a really strong athletic position, and that's how you want to get them comfortable hopping. And then from there, we can go into a bound, which basically just means you're going from right to left. It's a little bit more force and control. So she's going to go quick, to her right, and then stick it on her left. Perfect.
Oh, I see, like this.
Yeah.
So it's hop, hop.
Perfect.
Hold.
Nice.
That right. There we go.
Yeah, and we're working on truly getting comfortable in that athletic position, because that's where we play the game, right? That's where every change of direction happens. So those are kind of the basics. Cassie's going to take us to a much higher level.
All right. So, and I think that's important. The interesting part, at least about being a strength and conditioning professional and working with female athletes, is you're still running a business, right? And a lot of people come in and they say, hey, I want my kids to work on power, I want them to work on speed, and I want them blah, 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 blah. They don't need to be doing any of that weight stuff. They don't need to be doing any of that strength stuff. And I think what's really important is for us as professionals to just hold ourselves to a higher level and really take emphasis on educating the community on exactly what is needed. So we obviously need these strength movements prior to going into the power, prior to going into the cutting drills, prior to going into the sprint. And we need to become very confident and comfortable telling anybody who wants to consume our service, hey, this is really important. So part of the reason why we're doing this, and hopefully part of the other reason why we can educate other professionals to do the same. So the first thing we're gonna go back to that lateral step down. So Sarah's gonna hop back up on the step. And what we're doing, so once the athlete has progressed and has gotten really comfortable in the proper positioning, what we're gonna have them do is just hop off and stick the landing. So they're kind of stepping off and holding that positioning. And sorry, there's no warm up. They're not her sneakers, they're not her shoes. And then she'll step back up again. So again, she'll go back into it, hold that position, and she's working on everything that we just went over in that strength and training circuit, right? The last piece of it, once we get really comfortable with this, is we're trying to spend less time on the ground. So we'll hit, and then we'll pop back up again, okay? So Sarah's gonna give that a try. Once she's mastered stabilizing hit, and she pops back up. Obviously, we're trying to mitigate risk. No athlete should ever get hurt in a performance setting. So this is only once the athlete has mastered the previous phase, and we're able to then progress them to this next phase. So that's adding a little bit of the power component. When you think of power, you wanna think that there's actually a little bit of a time element involved. We're not just worried about overall strength, we're worried about how quickly and how forcefully that athlete can now produce that strength. Next, we're gonna get back to the lunge series. So Sarah's gonna go ahead and get in a lunge series. And I'm gonna do one of my favorite things that I ever get to do, is I get to mess around with the athlete. So the athlete needs to get comfortable getting hit like they would be on a field. So a lot of our soccer, field hockey, lacrosse, basketball, whatever it may be, can rest. They need to get comfortable getting hit and moved around a little bit, because it's, sport doesn't exist in a vacuum. They're not going to get bumped. They're going to get hit and moved around. So what we use, this is something that our MMA guys use, but really honestly, this could be anything. And this just adds it's a little bit easier than, punching someone around a little bit. I can kind of mess around a little bit more with the athlete and not have them get any bruising. It's frowned upon to hit athletes in here. Okay, so the next piece, when we go into we're gonna go into the lateral lunge position. So Sarah's gonna go ahead and get in a lateral lunge position. And let's say this athlete is working on what Sarah talked about, producing force out of that hold. So she's gonna go ahead, yeah, good. Yep, and as if she was gonna sprint this way potentially. What we would do first is just have her work on going slow first, getting out of it, and then we progress faster and faster until we're like, okay, this looks like gain speed, they're in it, boom, and now they're out of it. So once we progress that slowly, we can then say, okay, Sarah, you're gonna go once I tell you to go. So we're gonna go off of a, you're gonna go once I point. So she's gonna go off visually first, she's gonna be looking at my hand, and then I'm gonna say go, and I'll just point and she'll go. I'll then stand behind her, and now she can't see me, and now she's just going off of a clap. So now I've added an auditory component. Next piece I can add, you go there. Obviously, hopefully she doesn't run into the wall. I'll add a little bit of an extra stimulus so she's trying to get it before it bounces a second time. And again, you can add as many different variations of this as you want, but what we're trying to do is get creative with, okay, how can we stimulate her visually? How can we stimulate her to react auditorily? Auditory in an auditory aspect, how can we get her to then react to an outside object? The next thing we would then do is she would know, okay, we're definitely going to the right, but you're reacting off of me. So Sarah's go ahead, get in that position, and she knows she's going this way, boom, and then she's just reacting off me. The next thing we do, we get her in a neutral stance. So she's neutral, and now she doesn't know left or right, and now she's trying to follow me based off of which way I'm going. The last piece, what we talked about was getting an athlete really competitive, is we're gonna do something called mirror drill. So we can get two athletes next to each other. And let's say the drill is a 5-10-5, they're running 5 yards to the left, 10 yards back to the right, whatever it may be. They're now doing it, trying to keep up with an athlete. That's gonna put the athlete in a very heightened state of, okay, I'm ready, I have to keep up with her. It's almost like playing tag, right? So now the athlete isn't thinking about keeping the knee in the right spot. They're not thinking about keeping the hips in the right spot. We're purely seeing how the athlete moves. And it's important to remember that athletes are not great movers. Athletes are great compensators. Athletes are gonna find a way to do something because it's their sport and they're in it and they're competing. That doesn't always mean that they're gonna do it the right way. So us as practitioners or us as coaches are now able to actually observe that athlete and how they're looking in that really heightened state of competitive environment. Last piece to just kind of review, we talked about the hops, even just like the single leg hop positioning. A lot of times, again, when we go to do some of those single leg hops in a, just, hey, go ahead and hop on your own, the athlete might hop all over the place and you'll start to see that accuracy of where they're landing isn't quite always there. So if we wanted to, we can either put tape on the ground, grab a target or something for them to get into. And now when Sarah is going through her hops, she's now instructed to stay inside that box. Maybe now we're adding a little bit less timing straight. We're saying now you got to go left and right on one foot only. And now we're adding a little bit more of again, we're trying to challenge the athlete just a little bit more with a little bit more stimulus. So the main components, power, we're decreasing the time that the athlete is actually able to produce that force. We're trying to make them produce force extremely quickly. Next, we're going to be adding some form of a game-like pressure situation. So we're adding feedback as to, hey, if I hit you, if I move you here, and maybe you don't feel comfortable hitting an athlete just yet, but maybe they're holding weight in that position and then they drop one of the weights. That's the equivalent of moving your center of mass around. Doing all those things, adding a reactive component and then adding a competitive environment will just aid in taking those movements to the next level for a performance setting opposed to a recovery injury setting. And I think also Sarah can attest that when you start to be able to implement some of those competitive game-like settings, that's going to do probably a lot more for the athlete's mental health than it is going to be anything else, because we want them to feel like, hey, they're getting back to the field, not that they're just doing exercises just to rehab something. It's like, oh, okay, I'm becoming a better athlete. And if their identity is so wrapped up in that athleticism and their confidence is wrapped up in it, that's probably just as important as well. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? I think that was it.
I think that's it.
Okay. How are we on time?
We got time. You want to talk through some mental stuff?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So I think one of the things, let me just stand back here. I think one of the things that Cassie and I both definitely wanted to hit on, like, especially being that we're talking about the female athlete, both of us being female athletes, there's a huge mental, psychological side to performance, right? To sport. You're not going to be at the top of your game physically if you're not at the top of your game mentally. And Cassie has extensive experience on this, even from like a rehab perspective, right? Like it's tough. If you're sidelined with an injury, even if it's a few games, or especially if it's several months to a year, like that's really tough to handle, knowing that your whole identity was wrapped up in you competing and being in that sport, and now all of a sudden you can't, and it's kind of like, what do I do? So there's a couple ways to think about it. We always like to get people to be as involved in their team as they can, even if it's just a social aspect. I like to, kind of what Cassie was saying, like make the rehab competitive, like they're used to competing. I'm going to say like, listen, I want you to be able to do this by the end of today, or like, I want you to be able to do this motion by next Wednesday. And typically that's like, that'll cue them into it. Like if you give people shorter goals, it really helps them meet it. And that's kind of how like we play with the rehab side of things. I could go on for hours about this because it's like really particular, but I want Cassie to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So certainly one of the main reasons when we opened Athletes Warehouse, we had the PT group to be a part of this was because we wanted the integration to happen. It's like we just said, yes, we're talking about injury statistics and performance statistics, but they are one and the same. They're integrated, and it 100% needs to be a joint approach and how to recover this athlete into where they want to be, right? Because here's where the athlete's at and here's where they could be, and we're trying to help them fill that gap. One of the things that in particular with female athletes, which I think is extremely important, for the last 3 years, every single time an athlete comes to my session, they have to fill out a pre-hitting form, right? So they're filling out what they want to work on. And there's one question in particular. It says, what's your confidence on a scale of 1 to 10? You can't pick a 7 because everyone wants to pick a 7, but 8 or 6 just matters more. And I could show you the graph of what 10 and 11-year-old looks like. Their confidence at an 8 or 9. And the second you hit 14 years old, it plummets to an average of 4 or 5. So right around that time, 7 out of 10 female athletes are dropping out of sport. Puberty for males is awesome for them for the most part. They get bigger, which they want. They get taller, which they want. And females don't want to get bigger. Society has told them not to get bigger, right? And unless that, if an athlete went through puberty and it kind of affected how they felt like they should look or wanted to look, their confidence plummets. And it's there's a lot of statistics on this, but I think if anything, sports helps with that, right? I was talking to a basketball player and she was like, yeah, I wish I would have gotten taller because of her sport, because she wants to be in a great athlete in that sense. So I do think it's important to kind of keep an eye on our athletes right around that range. In addition, right when they start growing, especially if they grow fast, we joke that some athletes look like a baby giraffe because they've grown so fast, but they're at risk for injury at that time. They have limbs that are longer that they're not used to yet. The other thing too is posture is a huge deal. Females will typically grow faster than males. They'll hit puberty first. So if they are taller than their male counterparts, there's going to be a tendency for them to just be looking down a little bit more, shoulders forward. Working on posture alone, talking to them about confidence, talking to them about failure recovery, talking to them about adversity. It's not this naiveness that adversity won't ever hit. It's this confidence in the tools that they've developed in order to handle that adversity once it does hit, or that failure once it does hit. So I think having females and male coaches, female coaches, male professionals, female professionals who are just cognizant and aware of what these athletes might be going through during certain pockets of time is huge. I think that's really important. Anything else that I missed on that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think just really, I think what Cassie and I wanted to emphasize here is that like everything, like having Cassie and Athletes Warehouse here is totally awesome, because rehab professionals and strength, every coach should basically be working together, because it's always a continuum. Like even if people aren't exactly injured, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't focus on some of these recovery tools that we talked about today, right? It's always good to go back to basics in the off season. You don't need injury to be the thing that sends you back to this sort of stuff. So I think that's kind of like, we wanted to focus on the whole spectrum here, because especially with female athletes, it's something that I don't think we as a society like care as much about. Like a lot of guys, as soon as they hit puberty, are like, yes, let me hit the gym. I need to get big. I need to get strong for my sport. And a lot of female athletes are like, oh, I'm not supposed to like the gym. Like, that's scary. So I think, knowing that, like having the confidence that like you know what, I'm an athlete. If I want to be good at this, this is what I have to do. Is really important. Like, we're just trying to get that message out there, because it's something that I think I wish I heard when I was growing up.
I would agree with that. I showed up at college never lifting a weight. I'd done my push-ups and sit-ups at home, but I had not known. And I just think the education opportunity that the internet and social media has provided is huge. And to be able to have hopefully a platform that we can share that with is why we want to do this, obviously.
Yeah. Cool. So I think we'll open it up to you guys for some Q&A at this point.
I was going to say, we can move this up a little bit and make it.
Great.
All right, thank you, ladies. That was awesome. We definitely have a couple of questions I would want to address for both of you guys. I'll kind of leave it to both of you. I'll let you guys figure out who to answer these things for. First question is, how old do you have to be to start strength training? Are these exercises applicable to all ages?
Say it again. It was
How old should?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Do you want to do that one, or you want me to?
You can go.
Okay, so I hate saying it depends, but it certainly depends. We've seen certain 10-year-olds who look like they're 14, and we've seen certain 14-year-olds who look like they're 10, and even emotional maturity as well. So if an athlete is in a psychological state mature enough to handle what training actually should look like, or if they are potentially having a red flag for an injury that we might need to address, then the average age I say that is typically good is right around that age of 12, because we do still want the athlete having fun. And I think that's important, that once an athlete transitions to training, that's not the same as playing. Training is a little bit more structured. It's certainly not considered as much fun as what a competitive game environment would be. And we don't want to completely remove what fun should be going on for a younger athlete. The only time we've ever taken someone a little bit younger, they had never crawled and they had run same arm, same leg. They hadn't learned the opposite arm, opposite leg. So that was a little bit of a different, it was just teaching running mechanics to someone who was a little bit younger. But I suppose that's more of an outlier than what the average would be.
Yeah, and I think just really quickly to add on to that, like, there's this myth out there that like strength training will stunt people's growth, which is not true. Like, there's several studies that basically dispel that information. And what we're seeing now is athletes are getting injured at younger and younger ages. Like, we have 11 and 12-year-olds with ACL injuries, right? So that clearly shows that like they're not able to handle those forces that are placed on them. So strength training doesn't have to be back squatting, right? Like, I think that's what a lot of people think is like, oh, I can't have my 12-year-old like deadlifting. It's like, well, that's not what this is. There's certain aspects that are going to be helpful, even for kids at a young age, from a performance standpoint, from an injury prevention standpoint. So it doesn't have to be this wait until college to start training.
Movement awareness. Yeah, that's a big piece. That's really what it should be called.
Yeah.
Awesome. Just a reminder, anybody who's listening to us, please type in any questions you have into the Q&A feature. All right, let's see. Could you guys speak a little bit to the difference between adult females versus teenage females? And somebody specifically wants to know about cool down exercises for adult runners.
You want to take the adult runners one? And
Yeah.
Okay, so at least a couple of considerations that I've had in training, both adults and younger females. Younger females, if they have just hit their growth spurt, like I talked about, so there's a window of opportunity. When they start to grow, let's say their femur grew first, their hamstrings are all of a sudden really tight. I need to be really cognizant if we're going to be doing some landing stuff that they're not feeling comfortable in that. Yes, we want to retrain it, but I don't need to necessarily be pounding them a ton because they're going to be really sore. Additionally, I don't need to be loading them in a hinge position when their hamstrings haven't quite caught up to their femur growth. So that's just little considerations on how their growth is impacting what their running form looks like now that their limbs are a little bit longer. A couple things that I've had in consideration for adult females is if they've ever been pregnant and how they had their delivery, because that's going to impact certain exercises that I'm going to plan on doing, what their recovery had looked like post a C-section. A C-section is extremely traumatizing to the musculature of that individual. So just being cognizant of that and understanding how the body works, and maybe, hey, they might be compromised in certain positions because they haven't quite recovered from this, is even a couple of years later is important to know.
Yeah, and then when it comes to running, both adult and kids, like it's important to warm up and cool down, right? So as a runner myself, like I'll always save the last like 5 blocks of my run for a walk, right? We just need to get the body to cool down a little bit. Stretching afterwards is great. It feels good. You're not really looking to like improve your flexibility anywhere, especially if you're a runner. You're not really needing to get into any of these like crazy end range positions, right? Running is like a pretty stable exercise. You're kind of in this like one position for the whole thing. So it's really just more to like get your muscles to relax, get your heart rate down. You know, it's definitely important to get your body to cool down, do a couple of like, you know, hamstring stretch, quad stretch, calf stretch, hip flexor stretch should be good to go. Nothing, you don't really need anything crazy. Like I said, I feel like running injuries mostly happen due to poor loading and actually like decreased strength, because you're actually doing a single leg hop. If you're running a mile, you're doing a single leg hop for 8 minutes, or depending on your mile pace. So if you're running 10 miles, that's a ridiculous amount of loading on that limb. So it's often like your injuries are going to be more due to basically strength and endurance deficits rather than like a flexibility deficit. So I think a lot of people have this like, I need to stretch, and you know, yeah, it feels great. You should probably stretch to cool down. But in the end, it's probably not going to be like the difference maker in terms of when it comes to injuries.
It's a great point.
Awesome. All right. I know this is a very hot topic in terms of the female athlete world. Can you guys talk a little bit about the influence of the menstrual cycle on training?
Sure. I'll go a little bit into it, and then you can kind of, so this is something that I don't want to say that I'm treading lightly. It's just there is such a vastness to this topic that it would be a disservice to say that I could probably answer that in this short period of time. Certain things that I consider is really the same way that we're going to individualize a training program for an athlete based on how their knee reacts, how their ankle reacts, any previous injuries they had. We're going to individualize that training program to that athlete's cycle, or at least how they are impacted by their cycle. There are plenty of athletes that don't seem to feel some effects of their hormones changing, and then we have some athletes who feel extreme effects, whether that's anything from fatigue, even I don't know if anyone's worn a Whoop band, but people's sleep, no matter how many hours they get, their quality of sleep decreases while they're actually menstruating. So I need to understand that when they're coming in for their training the next day. It's not that they're being lazy, it's just that their body is not recovering as quickly. And then the last thing that I've just been very cognizant of is the hormone relaxin that kind of increases joint laxity throughout the body. So even something as simple as, hey, their lower back is kind of bugging them a little bit. They might have a little bit more range of motion. It might be a little harder for them to stabilize. That's not necessarily a training day that I need to be heavy deadlifting, that I need to be doing extreme broad jumps, extreme cutting mechanics, because that athlete is a little bit at risk. If you think about what it actually takes to cause an injury, once they have an increase in joint range of motion, as a practitioner, I'm trying to think, okay, how can we help this athlete so they don't need 3-4 days to recover from this one training session then?
Yeah, I think everything that Cassie said is so spot on. And the biggest piece too, when it comes to menstrual cycle, I know a lot of, at least when, playing lacrosse, ACL injury is like what everyone dreads, right? There's a lot of talk kind of under the radar, I feel like, about like, oh, like I tore my ACL when I was on my period, I tore my ACL, like that's a thought and everyone's like kind of nervous about it. Basically the big thing is like, if you train the proper way and you understand your body, as Cassie was saying, like, if you're feeling great, like there's certain things about the menstrual cycle that are awesome. Like there are certain times where you're going to feel the best you've felt. And like, that is so different than anything a male's ever going to feel, because he doesn't have that, that cycle. So we got to use it to our advantage for sure. And it's more about just listening to your body, I think, and being prepared to handle the forces. If you train the right way, you shouldn't be concerned about it, because your body's going to know how to absorb those forces. I think it's a super hot button topic right now. The research is pretty still inconclusive at this point, just because, like Cassie said, there's, some people are on one end of the spectrum when it comes to their symptoms, and some people are on the opposite. So it's going to be hard for us to really get into any real, like, concise, conclusions from the research. But I think it's definitely something to take into consideration. And if you're coaching or if you're working with an athlete, like, it shouldn't be a taboo topic. Basically, we shouldn't stay away from those questions.
The other thing that you just mentioned with like research being inconclusive, anything I found is that the other thing that I think is throwing off potentially what is going on is the diversity in birth control. So I think that is potentially impacting hormones throughout the cycle. And that is something, I just think the depth of where this conversation could go is immense. And I do hope that this conversation eventually leads to just making it a lot more comfortable for athletes and coaches and practitioners to be able to have this conversation with athletes.
Can you ladies speak a little bit more about the female athlete triad and how much you take that into consideration when working with athletes?
Totally, I can start with that. So the female athlete triad, or as it's kind of known now as REDS, which is basically relative energy deficiency in sport. So it's essentially the fact that, which happens a lot in female athletes, especially runners, especially athletes in their adolescence. If you're not fueling properly, there's, all these consequences that can happen. So especially in females, like if you notice, talking about the menstrual cycle, like if you notice your periods are getting more irregular, or especially if they kind of start to slow down and stop altogether, that's a red flag. Like I know, speaking from like my own experience and my teammates, like it used to be like, oh, I'm super in shape, I'm not even getting my period. It's like, that's wrong. Like that's a bad response. That's a red flag, actually. There could be bony issues. So like those of us who had stress fractures growing up, like your bones should be able to handle whatever your muscles can handle. And if they're not, that's a red flag. It means you're fueling improperly, or it means you're overtraining or overloading. So this whole like conversation around menstrual cycle, around like just being a female athlete and trying not to be huge, right? Like sometimes we want to look a certain way, and that's maybe not the greatest thing for our sport, especially if you're running a lot, like as a midfielder in lacrosse, like you're running a lot. It might not seem like you're out for a 6-mile run, but at the end of the game, you've done 8 miles. So you definitely need to be fueled properly. And it's up to us as professionals to work with really other, like registered dietitians, primary care physicians, like everyone needs to be in on this conversation. So it's really big, and I think people don't talk about it as much as they should. But when we see an athlete, especially with recurrent stress injuries, right? Like that's always my kicker I need to refer them to someone who's going to be able to get the full side of things. Like I'm not a registered dietitian. I'm not a nutrition professional, but we know people who do that, and who we should send them to, because it takes a village. And if someone's getting bony stress injuries at the age of 14, that's something that you need to take into consideration now before it, develops later in life.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah hit on all that. I just think the conversation too with like, just going back to the ACL and kind of what we talked about is, we know so much. If you look at the last 15, 20 years, the amount of studies that have happened, the conversations that have been happening around females and ACLs and injuries is improved tremendously, but the number of incidents of injury has continued to improve. So we're not quite there yet. I think that's what's important is like, yes, we are learning a lot and we have great people in place, but we do still need to be continuing to make that push and really bridge the gap between what research is talking about and what's actually happening on the field and what's actually happening in the trenches, so that we can get to the bottom of this and hopefully start to decrease that incidence of injuries.
Is there an ideal time to stretch post-workout?
I'm going to say it depends on the athlete. I think we have certain athletes who are hypermobile, and I actually don't want them stretching post-workout. I also think athletes who have a chronically tight hip, chronically tight back, that's usually a red flag that that body is protecting them from something. And that's a deeper conversation. So that is just what I was going to say after that. If the athlete is not in that scenario though,
yeah, I mean, I think you kind of said it best, like post-workout, right? Like as you're warm from your workout, it's a good time to stretch those muscles. I'm kind of in Cassie's camp, and especially when it comes to the female athlete, like I said, we generally have more of that relaxin hormone. Like a lot of our ligaments are more lax when compared to like male athletes. So it's usually like, I kind of agree with Cassie, like it's usually not a decrease in flexibility of a muscle that is giving you a tightness. It's usually like, other muscles are, certain muscles are overworking because other muscles are underworking, right? So it's more of, we need to figure out that imbalance, less than a stretch. But if it feels great and you like stretching because it feels good, fine, go for it. probably not going to hurt yourself if you do it right after you work out.
I got a good one for you guys here. How could the movements for recovery that you guys demonstrated be progressed to elicit increases in strength for female athletes? And could it be an approach for injury prevention as well?
Yes, and I think what's important is that you're going to eventually get an athlete who needs to go into a progressive overload instance. So many times I get athletes, a parent comes in or an athlete says, I don't want to lift weight. And the idea is that we can progress body weight as much as we need to, but anybody who worked out at home during COVID, you might have gotten really good at body weight workouts and volume might not just be enough. So adding a little bit of load, external load to the system, adding whether that's in a form of a band or a weight or whatever that ends up looking like, I think is extremely important. And that's how you progress the athlete. Obviously, when you go into programming, you have a cycle or an oscillating cycle of, hey, we're going to progress and then we're going to deload and then we're going to progress and then we're going to deload. And that's how we eventually get the athlete moving into more complex movements where we're combining strength movements, let's say, or doing compound movements.
Yeah, totally. I agree. Like basically you can put some of these movements together, like Cassie was saying, and make them compound. You can also turn them into more of a plyometric movement. So plyometric basically just means that you're using like the stretch shortening cycle of the muscle. So you're using that eccentric to quick concentric force. It starts to get into the power piece that Cassie's talking about. So if you're doing a lateral lunge, right, and then you want to progress it and you don't have weights, or you've already done weights and now you want to focus on power and timing, you can get them to go into that lunge and push off, right? So you're working on that eccentric to concentric force. Really trying to be quick on the ground. Like that's a progression from a strength exercise. And you can do that with pretty much anything here. You can progress in like so many different ways. But those are just, a couple of pieces.
To give one more example too, doing an isometric hold plus the movement so let's say we're doing the lunge, try holding that lunge for 10 to 20 seconds and then actually progressing into the movement, and you'll see you kind of got this hold, you got this blood flow, and now you're actually demanding a little bit more force out of the muscle. It's just training safely training in a fatigue state.
All right, a couple quick hitters for you ladies before we wrap up here. For everybody listening home, we will record all this and try to get to as many of these questions as possible. So this will all be recorded on our YouTube channel. So in case anybody misses anything or wants to go back and view something. All right, couple quick hitters. Can you train in season?
Yes. You should be.
All right.
Season.
Totally. It does. Sorry.
Oh,
okay.
Well, just to go, if you do concentric work, you're not creating muscle breakdown. You're going to be you're essentially maintaining strength and continuing to progress your power. You're not going to be sore. There's ways to train. You're not going to be sore. That's all. Yeah.
All right. Have you seen a change in injuries due to COVID?
Not for my athletes, actually.
Yeah. Well, Cassie trains them too well, so they're not getting injured. But I've seen more athletes in the PT room just from not doing anything for a year. And then all of a sudden here in Westchester, we have these sports that have just gone straight through from January to May. So now at this point, they've done nothing. And now they've done 3 months of straight sports. So we're definitely seeing some overuse injuries, some acute injuries. Just a reminder to stay training and up to date with this stuff. I know it was hard with COVID, but don't go into anything too quickly.
It's not necessarily a local scale, but on a national scale, college softball has experienced the most injuries, most season-ending injuries out of any season they have ever seen in the last 25 years, which I think is significant. It's not just little bumps and bruises, it's ACLs, UCLs, labrums. So I think there's certainly been an impact.
Can females get stronger without getting bigger?
Yes.
100%. Such a myth.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, it's just like, I feel like we all think that growing up, and like, you're not going to put on muscle unless you work out in a very particular way that is your goal, and you fuel in a particular way that is your goal. If you're not fueling the right way or strengthening in like a hypertrophy type of setting, you're not going to put on really that much muscle. You're going to get lean, you're going to get powerful, you're going to get strong. You're not going to get bulky unless you're training with someone that's their goal for you.
I'll tell you the biggest thing I see happening is athletes will come in, they start training for the first time, and they are not cognizant of their fuel. So yeah, when you work out, you're going to get hungrier, but that doesn't mean you need to double your calories. So it's not uncommon to see certain people who are just very unaware of what food intake they're taking in, or they have the perception that because they're working out, they can intake whatever they want. They might see an increase in weight while they're working out because they just haven't been able to manage their hunger and what exactly the proper fueling techniques are for themselves.
All right, and last one here. Best piece of advice you could give either to your 16-year-old self or to a 16-year-old athlete listening to this webinar?
Oh, that's a good one. I think probably the best piece of advice that I could give is to not stress too much over the little things. Like we talked about, like the mental side is so huge. And I definitely I went through a bunch of injuries in high school. It's part of the reason I'm a PT. And it was stressful. And I definitely didn't think about my body in the way that I should have, I think, because there just wasn't the emphasis on it. So I would say just to, be cognizant of, multiple sports, first of all, because that automatically puts you at a decreased risk for injury, right? If you're doing different things rather than the same sport all year. But also just to not, don't think that your next move is going to control your whole life, because 9 times out of 10, it's not.
Yeah, I guess my advice would be kind of similar, and just to continue to search for an attitude of gratitude in everything I did. So instead of being bummed out about a particular injury, because the reason I'm a strength coach is because I played with a back injury all 4 years of college, and I just sat there thinking there was probably something more I could have been doing. Maybe someone could have noticed this was happening before I even got here. So just instead of looking at like, woe is me, I instead could have looked at that as an opportunity to get better at other things and just have more of an attitude of gratitude that I was actually playing, even though it might have been in a little bit of pain. And obviously it led me to my profession here. So that would have been my advice, to just continue to focus on where the gratitude is needed there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sarah, Cassie. I appreciate you guys and all your answers and time and demonstrations and all that. And I know everybody else here did too. For everybody who joined us, thank you all so much. We hope today's talk was valuable and you learned about training the female athlete. If we didn't get to your question, we'll do our best to reach out to you directly afterwards. We'll also be sending a handout from this webinar with a recap of the important facts, as well as the exercises that Sarah and Cassie went over together. As you see, their contact information is up on the slide here as we're talking. We'll leave it up for a few minutes so you guys can get their information. Let's see here. Again, this webinar was recorded, so you guys can please go on our YouTube channel and view it. If you have any questions or want to go back and view a few of the exercises and things like that, please feel free to do so. So again, your presenters were Sarah and Cassie. Their contact info is up there. Please feel free to jot it down if you want to reach out to them directly. They're more than happy to answer questions. Cassie will be happy to get anybody who's interested in Athletes Warehouse here in Westchester and for an evaluation. She'd be happy to speak to you as well on the sports performance side. And Sarah will be absolutely happy to do the same here on the physical therapy side, and also virtually as well. I know both Athletes Warehouse and Spear are doing virtual appointments here. All right. And a special thank you to Alyssa, who is helping on the back end with some of the Q&As. So again, we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. My contact info and Alyssa's contact info will be up here for a couple seconds for anybody. If you guys want to jot it down to reach out to us, we can happily facilitate getting in touch with Sarah, Cassie, or any of our great therapists that we all have. At Spear, we treat a variety of conditions from head to toe. And as a reminder, we're open for in-person visits as well as telehealth sessions. Should you feel you could benefit from one of our individualized guidelines or treatments, please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us individually, and we'll personally coordinate bringing you with one of our therapists, as well as in an evaluation with Athletes Warehouse as well up here in Pleasantville. We continue to host webinars throughout the 2021 summer here, covering a variety of topics. We look forward to seeing you back here for the future ones, and please pay attention to us on social media and on YouTube for recordings and that like. Thank you guys for spending the afternoon with us. We hope you had a great time, and be well. Take care.